everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name's Hannah and I make videos about fashion, style, and sewing, and today I'm going to be showing you some ways that you can finish your seams at home on your home sewing machine. No serger required. It'll give your garments or whatever you're making a really professional finish, and these techniques are really simple and I'm going to walk you through every step. So today we're going to be going through 4 seam finishes. We're going to be learning stitched and turned seam finish method, the stitched and pinked seam finish method. We're also going to be talking about a French seam and also a flat felled seam. I hope you can learn something new from this video because I definitely did. If you like this video, make sure you give it a like and subscribe to my channel, check out some of my other videos, and also make sure you check out some of my other social media pages. I have Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, Pinterest, and I will link those all down below for you. So without further ado, let's get sewing. I'm going to be showing you today's seam finishing techniques on some unbleached muslin, and I'm going to be using some contrast color thread just so you can really see all the detail on a small scale. And I would really recommend that you practice these skills on some scrap fabric before you apply them to your actual garments, just so you get some practice. My first step is going to be to stitch my normal seam allowance, which is 1/2 inch. Now that I have my seam pressed open, I'm going to stitch about 1/8 inch away from the edge of each side of the seam allowances. If you're working with a straight edge seam like I am, these stitch lines aren't absolutely necessary, but they do help for the next step where we fold each of them under and then do a quick top stitch. The final step in this process is to turn these over and stitch through the seam allowance only, and then after that's done, we're going to press this open. For this step, you want to sew as close to the edge as possible. As you can see, our raw edge is concealed underneath our seam allowance. This just gives a simple way to have a nice professional seam finish. And once you press this open, it will look really nice. For this next seam finish, I've already gone ahead and stitched my sample fabric at a 1/2 inch seam allowance and pressed that seam open. So the first thing we're going to do is stitch approximately 1/4 inch away from the seam allowances only. Now that we've stitched away from our edges, you're going to need some pinking shears, which is just this simple little tool, and it's called pinking. And what we're going to do is we're just going to trim each of these sides with our pinking shears. And that's our finished seam for the stitched and pinked technique. The next technique I'm going to be showing you is a little bit more complicated. That's why instead of a muslin fabric, like I said before, I'm going to be showing you on this printed fabric because it has an obvious right side and an obvious wrong side, which will allow you to see exactly what I'm doing at each step of the way. The French seam is a little bit different because it's something called an encased seam, meaning that the cut edges of your seam allowance are going to be encased or enclosed within the seam itself. This is a really great technique for lightweight fabrics, for making dresses, for making your side seams look really professional, and it's great for lightweight fabrics because it can cause some additional bulk because of the encasing of the seam allowance, but it's honestly just a really great technique to learn. So the first step for this technique is actually going to be to pin the wrong sides together. Now I'm going to take this to my machine and I'm going to sew it at 3/8 inch seam allowance. Alright, so I have my seam allowance sewn at 3/8 inch. Now what we're going to do is we're going to trim this down so that I only have 1/8 inch left on my seam allowance. Now that I have my seam allowance trimmed to 1/8 of an inch, I'm going to take this, fold it out, and then fold this side over. So now my right sides are together. You want to make sure that your stitch line is exactly on your fold. So you have to kind of work with it a little bit to make sure that it is flat and that your stitch line is right on this fold. And what you're going to do is press this flat once you have your stitch line worked out to the fold. Now that I have this pressed and my right sides are together, we've made sure that our stitch line is right on the fold, I'm going to stitch this using my straight stitch at 1/4 of an inch from the edge. This step is really important because this is actually the step that will encase your cut edges of your seam allowance within that seam. Alright, so this is our finished French seam on the inside of our garment. This is our channel that we've created to encase our 1/8 of an inch cut edge of our seam allowance. And then you can see on the right side that none of our threads are peeking through. That's why you want to make sure that your final stitching seam allowance with your right sides together is a bit wider than your cut edge seam allowance, which was 1/8 of an inch. And you can really do this with any seam allowance. It doesn't have to be these exact measurements, as long as you are making a channel that encases your cut edge of your seam allowance and you don't see any raveled threads on your right side of your fabric. The final stitch that I'll be showing you today is categorized as a top stitch seam. It's a little bit like a French seam, but it's called a flat fell seam, which is really popular in menswear, children's play clothes. You see it a lot on jeans and just some other tailored garments. Essentially, both seam allowances are enclosed so the raw edges cannot ravel. Like I said, it's a little bit similar to the French seam that I just showed you, which is why I have the same printed fabric so that we can see with our right sides and our wrong sides exactly what steps we're going through. So the first step in our flat fell seam is to pin, once again like the French seam, with our wrong sides together. And I'm just going to take this to my machine and I'm going to stitch using a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Now that we have our 5/8 inch seam allowance stitched down, we're going to take this and we're going to press our seam allowance to one side. It doesn't necessarily matter which side you press it to as long as it's pressed flat. This seam finish can be a little bit tricky because all of your stitching is done on the right side of your garment, meaning you want it to be really precise, really accurate, and take your time to measure and make sure your stitching is as straight as possible. So our next step is going to be to trim this lower seam allowance to 1/8 of an inch. Alright, so now that we have one seam allowance at 5/8 of an inch and one seam allowance at 1/8 of an inch, we are going to turn our longer seam allowance under by 1/4 of an inch, flip it over like this, and we're going to press this down. Now you really want to take the time to make sure this edge is straight and it's an even width from edge of your seam to your edge of your seam. Now that we have our upper seam allowance turned over 1/4 of an inch and pressed down, our final step is going to be to stitch just close to this edge on the right hand side, or whatever side that you chose. Essentially, we're just going to stitch as close to the edge as possible on our folded edge, and that stitch is going to go through all of the layers. So that's why this is called a top stitch seam, because you are applying a top stitch, which is called an edge stitch, right to this folded edge, which is going to encase all of your raw cut seam allowance edges. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take this over to my machine and stitch as close to this edge as possible. And this is our finished flat felled top stitch seam. Here it is from the back. As I said before, you can't see any of the cut seam allowance edges. So I think this is just a really great stitch. Here are all of the seam finish techniques that we learned today. We have our turned and stitched finish, our stitched and pinked finish, our flat felled seam finish, and our French seam finish. If you have any questions on any of these techniques, or you think there's one that I missed, please let me know in the comments below and I'd be happy to share some more techniques.